My son visits me every Sunday and always brings an expensive wine. His rule is clear. If you're drinking alone, drink this one. If I say my wife will drink with me, he takes the wine away. Last Sunday I lied. I said I'd be drinking alone, and that simple lie saved my life. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Bruce, and for 8 months now, my son Vincent has been visiting me every Sunday with the same routine. He arrives at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, always carrying a bottle of expensive wine and always asking the same question. Are you alone, Dad? At first I thought it was sweet. Vincent had always been distant, even as a child. After his mother died 12 years ago, our relationship became even more strained. So when he started these weekly visits last spring, I felt grateful. Finally, my son wanted to spend time with his old man, but there was something odd about the way he asked that question. Not, how are you doing, or how was your week? Always, are you alone? And depending on my answer, the entire visit would change. If I said yes, Vincent would smile, hand me the wine and settle into the living room for what seemed like a caring conversation. He'd ask about my health, my medications, whether I'd seen any doctors recently. He'd inquire about my daily routine, who I'd talked to during the week, if any neighbors had stopped by. At the time, I interpreted this as genuine concern, but if my wife Margaret was home, everything shifted. Vincent's demeanor would become cold, almost irritated. He'd keep the wine clutched in his hands, make polite but brief conversation, and leave within 15 minutes. Margaret noticed it too. There's something wrong with that boy, she told me after his 3rd visit. He looks at me like I'm in his way. I defended him, of course. Vincent was my only child, and after losing my wife Sarah, he was one of the few family connections I had left. Margaret, my second wife of 4 years, tried to be understanding, but I could see the hurt in her eyes every time Vincent basically ignored her presence. The wine was always expensive, $200, sometimes $300 a bottle. Vincent worked in sales for a pharmaceutical company, and while he did well for himself, these weren't bottles someone bought casually. Each one came from small vineyards I'd never heard of, places with names like Sunset Ridge Estate or Highland Valley Reserve. This is special, Dad, he'd say, setting the bottle carefully on my kitchen counter. You should drink this alone. Really savor it. Wine like this deserves your full attention. I found that strange too. In all my 63 years, I'd never been much of a wine connoisseur. I preferred beer or the occasional whiskey, but Vincent insisted these wines required a particular appreciation, a certain mood. Wait until Margaret's at her book club, he'd suggest. Or maybe Sunday evening when you can really relax. The bottles would sit in my wine rack for weeks. I'd occasionally open one and pour myself a glass, usually following Vincent's advice to drink it alone. The taste was complex, sometimes bitter, with an aftertaste that lingered longer than I expected. I often felt unusually tired after finishing a glass, sometimes even dizzy. I attributed it to my age or the alcohol content. Margaret started questioning the routine around the 5th visit. Why does he care so much about whether I'm here or not? She asked while folding laundry in our bedroom. And why does he always look around the house like he's checking to see if anyone else is here? I hadn't noticed that detail, but once she mentioned it, I couldn't unsee it. Vincent did look around. He'd glance toward the driveway, peek into the kitchen, even ask if I was expecting anyone else to visit. When our neighbor Mrs. Henderson stopped by unexpectedly during one of his visits, Vincent became visibly uncomfortable and cut his visit short. Maybe he just wants private time with his father, I suggested to Margaret, but even as I said it, something felt off. The breaking point came on a rainy Sunday in October. Margaret was supposed to be at her sister's house for the afternoon, but she returned early because her sister had fallen ill. When Vincent arrived and saw her car in the driveway, his face changed. Not disappointment exactly, but something harder. Anger, maybe. He came inside anyway, but his entire demeanor was different. Instead of his usual questions about my health and routine, he barely spoke. He kept checking his watch and finally left after only 20 minutes, taking the wine with him. I'll bring this by another time, Dad, he said, but his tone was cold. When you can properly enjoy it. After he left, Margaret and I sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally she spoke. Bruce, that's not normal behavior for a son visiting his father. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the 8 months of Sunday visits, trying to understand what felt so wrong about them. Vincent's questions weren't really about my well-being. They were about my isolation. Who had I seen? Who had called? Was I alone during the week? Did Margaret have plans? It felt like surveillance, not care. The next morning I decided to pay attention to details I'd previously ignored. I started keeping a small notebook, jotting down Vincent's exact questions, the wines he brought, how I felt after drinking them. The pattern that emerged made my stomach turn. Vincent wasn't visiting because he loved me. He was visiting because he needed to know something, and whatever that something was, it required me to be completely alone. The notebook I started keeping revealed things I wished I hadn't seen. Every entry painted a picture that made less sense the more I analyzed it, yet formed a terrifying pattern I couldn't ignore. Vincent's questions weren't random. They followed a systematic approach that reminded me of the sales training manuals I'd seen when I worked in insurance. He'd start with open-ended questions about my week, then gradually narrow down to specifics. Had I driven anywhere? Did I have any medical appointments scheduled? Was Margaret working her usual shifts at the library? More disturbing was how much he already seemed to know about my routine. During his November visits, he'd make casual comments that revealed an uncomfortable familiarity with my daily life. "Did you get that prescription refilled?" he'd ask, even though I hadn't mentioned needing any refills. "How's your blood pressure been since Dr. Martinez adjusted your medication?" How did he know about my medication changes? I'd never told him about my appointments with Dr. Martinez. Margaret noticed it too. "He knows when I work late shifts," she told me while washing dishes after one particularly uncomfortable visit. "Last week he asked if I was still doing Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the library. I never told him my schedule." The wine situation became even stranger when I started paying closer attention to the labels and vintages. Each bottle Vincent brought came from vineyards that, when I researched them online, had very limited production. Some were so exclusive they didn't even have websites. When I called one of the vineyards directly, pretending to be interested in purchasing wine, the woman on the phone told me they only sold through private dealers and specialized distributors. "These aren't wines you find in regular stores," I told Margaret. "They're almost impossible to get unless you know exactly where to look." But the most unsettling discovery came when I started documenting how I felt after drinking Vincent's wine. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Within an hour of finishing a glass, I'd feel drowsy, sometimes confused. My heart would race, then slow down dramatically. Once Margaret found me asleep in my chair at 4 in the afternoon, something that never happened normally. "You were breathing so shallow I almost called 911, she said when I woke up disoriented and nauseous. I decided to test something. The next time Vincent brought wine, instead of drinking it alone as he insisted, I poured a glass for Margaret and myself to share during dinner. The bottle had been sitting in my wine rack for 2 weeks since his last visit. Within 30 minutes, both of us felt sick. Margaret experienced dizziness and nausea. I felt like my heart was skipping beats. We both ended up spending the evening in bed, feeling like we had food poisoning, even though we'd eaten the same meal we'd prepared dozens of times before. "That wine was bad," Margaret said the next morning, still pale. "Maybe it was spoiled or something." But I was starting to suspect it wasn't spoilage. Vincent's behavior during his visits also followed patterns I was beginning to recognize. He'd always arrive when he knew Margaret would likely be out. He'd called ahead several times to confirm she'd be at work or with friends. When she was home unexpectedly, his visits became short and agitated. He also had an unusual interest in my health records and medical information. During his December visits, he started asking detailed questions about my doctors, my insurance policies, and even my legal arrangements. "Dad, you should make sure your will is updated," he said one afternoon. "Things change and you want to make sure everything's properly documented." I found it odd that a 35-year-old man was suddenly concerned about estate planning. Vincent had never shown interest in family finances or legal matters before. When I mentioned that I'd already worked with an attorney to update my will after marrying Margaret, his expression darkened. "Margaret's included in your will?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Of course she is. She's my wife." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Vincent stared out the window for a long moment before changing the subject completely. Later that week, I received a call from my attorney's office. Someone had requested information about my will and estate planning documents, claiming to be my son checking on my behalf. My attorney hadn't provided any information, but he wanted to verify that I had actually requested someone to inquire. I hadn't, and when I asked Vincent about it during his next visit, he claimed to know nothing about any phone calls. The breaking point came during Christmas week. Vincent had insisted on bringing a special bottle of wine for Christmas dinner, something he claimed cost over $500. But when Margaret and I both attended Christmas service at our church that morning, something he hadn't expected. His plans seemed to change. He arrived at our house agitated, checking his phone constantly. Instead of the celebratory mood I'd expected, he seemed nervous, almost angry. When Margaret suggested we open his special wine with dinner for all three of us to share, Vincent became adamant that it wasn't the right time. "This wine needs to be appreciated properly, Dad. Maybe tomorrow when you can really focus on the experience." But Margaret pressed him. "It's Christmas, Vincent. Wine is meant to be shared with family." The look he gave her was pure hatred. Not annoyance, not frustration. Hatred. That night, after Vincent left with his unopened bottle of wine, Margaret and I sat in our living room among the discarded wrapping paper and holiday decorations. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken fears. "Bruce," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think Vincent is trying to hurt you." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I wanted to deny it, to defend my son, to find rational explanations for everything we'd observed. But 8 months of documented patterns, strange coincidences, and increasingly hostile behavior had led us to the same terrifying conclusion. My son wasn't visiting me out of love. He was visiting me for a reason that required me to be alone, vulnerable, and isolated from anyone who might protect me. The question that kept me awake that night was simple but horrifying. What exactly was Vincent planning to do? The Sunday that changed everything started like any other. Margaret was getting ready for her monthly visit to her sister Patricia, who lived about 2 hours away in Richmond. They'd planned to spend the day antiquing and catching up, something they did religiously on the first Sunday of each month. But at the last minute, Patricia called to cancel. She'd come down with a nasty flu and didn't want to risk getting Margaret sick. Margaret was disappointed but decided to make the best of it by organizing our photo albums, a project she'd been putting off for months. When 2 o'clock approached and I heard Vincent's car in the driveway, something inside me shifted. For the first time in 8 months, I made a conscious decision to lie to my son. Vincent knocked and entered as usual, carrying his expensive wine and wearing that familiar smile that I was beginning to recognize as calculated rather than genuine. "Hey, Dad, how are you doing today?" "Good, good," I replied, my heart pounding harder than it should have been. "Margaret left for Patricia's about an hour ago. Won't be back until late tonight." Vincent's entire demeanor changed instantly. The tension in his shoulders relaxed and his smile became more genuine, more eager. "Perfect, I brought something special today." He held up the bottle, a vintage from somewhere called Mountain Peak Vineyards. "This one's supposed to be incredible. Really smooth, perfect for a quiet Sunday afternoon." Margaret was upstairs in our bedroom, sorting through old photographs. If she heard Vincent arrive, she was being deliberately quiet, perhaps sensing that something important was about to happen. "You know what, Dad? Why don't you open this now and have a glass while I'm here? We can enjoy it together." Vincent's suggestion was different from his usual routine. Normally, he insisted I save the wine for later, to drink alone and savor properly. This change in pattern sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. "Sure, son, that sounds nice." Vincent opened the bottle with practiced efficiency, pouring 2 glasses of deep red wine that looked perfectly normal. He handed me mine and raised his own in a toast. "To Sunday afternoons with my old man." We clinked glasses and I brought mine to my lips, pretending to take a sip while actually just letting the wine touch my lips without swallowing. Vincent, I noticed, barely touched his own glass to his mouth. We sat in the living room and Vincent began his usual line of questioning, but with more intensity than I'd ever heard before. "So, Dad, how have you been feeling this week? Any dizzy spells? Problems with your heart medication?" I've been fine. I lied again, setting my glass down after another fake sip. Dr. Martinez says my blood pressure is the best it's been in years. Vincent's expression flickered with something I couldn't quite identify. Disappointment, frustration. That's great, Dad. Really great. You know, at your age, it's important to be aware of any changes. Heart problems can come on suddenly. The conversation continued for about 20 minutes, with Vincent asking increasingly specific questions about my health, my daily routine, and my medical appointments. He seemed particularly interested in whether I'd been feeling confused lately, or if I'd had any memory problems. Sometimes people our age don't realize when they're having small episodes, he said, watching my face carefully. Little moments of confusion that could indicate bigger problems. I played along, giving vague answers while pretending to drink the wine. Vincent kept checking his watch and glancing toward the stairs as if expecting something to happen. Finally, he stood up. Well, Dad, I should probably head out. You finish that wine and relax. You deserve it. He picked up his barely touched glass and took it to the kitchen, where I heard him pour it down the drain. After Vincent left, I sat in the living room staring at my still full wine glass. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and carried it carefully to the kitchen. Instead of drinking it or pouring it out, I found a clean mason jar and poured the wine into it, sealing it tight. Margaret came downstairs 20 minutes later. Did Vincent leave already? Yes, he brought wine again. Did you drink it? I showed her the mason jar. No, and I'm going to find out exactly what's in this. The next morning I drove to the medical center where my friend Tom worked as a lab technician. Tom and I had served in Vietnam together, and I trusted him completely. I told him I suspected someone was tampering with my medication and asked if he could test the wine discreetly. Bruce, if someone's trying to poison you, you'll need to call the police, Tom said after I explained the situation. I need to know for sure first. Please, Tom. Just tell me what's in this wine. Tom agreed to run the test, but it took 3 days to get results. Those were the longest 3 days of my life. I couldn't eat properly, couldn't sleep, and found myself jumping every time the phone rang, terrified it might be Vincent calling to check on me. When Tom called with the results, his voice was grim. Bruce, you need to sit down. Just tell me. There's digitalis in this wine, a lot of it. My blood ran cold. Digitalis was a heart medication, but in large doses it could cause heart failure. It could kill someone, especially someone my age with existing heart conditions. Tom, what would have happened if I'd drunk this? Given your age and medical history, you'd probably be dead, Bruce. This much digitalis would have caused a massive heart attack. It would look completely natural, especially considering your existing heart condition. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the mason jar of wine that could have killed me. Vincent, my own son, had been slowly poisoning me for 8 months. Each bottle of wine had been laced with enough digitalis to weaken my heart gradually, and this final bottle contained enough to finish the job. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Vincent hadn't been visiting me out of love or concern. He'd been visiting me to monitor my deterioration and ensure I was isolated when he delivered the fatal dose. His questions about my health weren't caring inquiries, they were progress reports on his own deadly plan. The expensive wines weren't gifts, they were delivery mechanisms for poison. The insistence that I drink alone wasn't about appreciation, it was about ensuring no witnesses. His anger when Margaret was present wasn't rudeness, it was frustration that his plans were being interrupted. Margaret found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at the mason jar. Bruce, you look like you've seen a ghost. I told her everything Tom had discovered. Margaret's face went pale, then hardened with an anger I'd never seen from her before. He was going to kill you, she whispered. Your own son was going to murder you. We sat together in stunned silence, processing the enormity of what we'd learned. My son, the child I'd raised, had been systematically poisoning me for months with the goal of inheriting my estate. Every Sunday visit had been a step closer to my death, but the most chilling realization was yet to come. If I hadn't lied that Sunday, if Margaret had actually gone to Patricia's as planned, I would be dead right now. That lie, that simple deception about being alone had saved my life. The question now was, what were we going to do about it? The days following Tom's revelation were a blur of fear, anger, and desperate investigation. Margaret and I barely spoke, each lost in our own horror at what Vincent had been doing. But once the initial shock wore off, I became determined to understand the full scope of my son's betrayal. I started by examining every bottle of wine Vincent had brought over the past 8 months. Most were already empty, consumed during those lonely evenings when I'd followed his advice to savor them properly. But 3 bottles remained unopened in my wine rack. Margaret and I carefully collected them, treating them like evidence, which I suppose they were. Tom tested all 3 bottles, and each contained varying levels of digitalis. The earliest bottle had smaller amounts, what Tom described as conditioning doses, designed to gradually weaken my heart without causing immediate symptoms. The most recent bottle contained enough digitalis to stop my heart within hours. This was a long-term plan, Tom explained when he delivered the results. Whoever did this knew enough about cardiac medicine to design a systematic poisoning that would appear to be natural heart failure. Vincent's pharmaceutical sales background suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. He had access to medical knowledge, connections with doctors, and understanding of how heart medications worked. He'd used his professional expertise to plan my murder. But the poisoning was only part of the story. When I began investigating more carefully, I discovered that Vincent had been manipulating more than just my wine consumption. I called Dr. Martinez's office and requested copies of all my medical records from the past year. What I found made my blood run cold. According to the records, I'd been experiencing symptoms I'd never actually had. There were notes about confusion, memory problems, and episodes of disorientation that I'd supposedly reported during appointments. But I remembered those appointments clearly, and I'd never mentioned any such symptoms. I called Dr. Martinez directly. Doctor, I'm looking at my records, and there are some discrepancies I need to understand. Of course, Bruce. What can I clarify for you? These notes about confusion and memory problems. I don't recall discussing those issues with you. There was a pause. Bruce, those symptoms were reported to me by your son, Vincent. He called several times over the past few months, expressing concern about changes in your behavior. He said you had been having episodes but were too embarrassed to mention them during your appointments. My grip tightened on the phone. Vincent called you about my health? Yes, he was quite worried. He mentioned that you'd been forgetting conversations, getting lost driving to familiar places, and having trouble managing your medications. He asked me to keep an eye out for signs of cognitive decline. Vincent had been building a medical paper trail that would support a narrative of my deteriorating health. When I died of apparent heart failure, the records would show a pattern of declining mental and physical condition that would make my death seem inevitable and natural. Dr. Martinez, I need you to understand something. I've never experienced any of those symptoms. Vincent has been lying to you. Another pause, longer this time. That's very concerning, Bruce. We should discuss this in person. I made an appointment for the following day, but first I needed to understand more about Vincent's motivations. Why was my son trying to kill me? Margaret and I spent that evening going through my financial documents, looking for anything that might explain Vincent's desperation. What we found painted a disturbing picture of greed and entitlement. My life insurance policy was substantial, worth $800,000, with Vincent listed as the primary beneficiary. Margaret, as my wife, would inherit the house and most of my savings, but Vincent stood to gain significantly from my death. Additionally, I'd recently updated my retirement accounts to include provisions for both Margaret and Vincent, meaning my son would receive approximately $400,000 immediately upon my death. Over $1 million was enough motivation for murder, but I sensed there was more to Vincent's desperation. I decided to hire a private investigator. I called Frank Morrison, a former police detective who'd helped a friend of mine with a family matter years earlier. When I explained the situation, Frank was immediately interested. Financial murder is more common than people think, Frank told me during our first meeting. Family members are statistically the most likely to commit this type of crime. Let me do some digging into your son's background. What Frank discovered over the next week was devastating. Vincent wasn't just greedy, he was desperate. His pharmaceutical sales job, which I'd thought was successful, was actually in jeopardy. He'd been caught falsifying sales reports and was facing termination. Worse, he'd been gambling heavily and owed significant money to some very dangerous people. "Your son has debts totaling over $200,000, Frank reported. "Some of it's to casinos, but a good portion is to private lenders who don't take kindly to late payments. He's been getting threats. Vincent needed money quickly, and my death would solve all his problems. The life insurance payout would cover his debts, and the inheritance would set him up for a fresh start." But Frank's investigation revealed something even more chilling. Vincent had been researching my daily routine for months before he started the Sunday visits. He'd been watching our house, tracking Margaret's schedule, and learning our habits. The Sunday visits weren't spontaneous expressions of filial affection. They were carefully planned surveillance missions designed to establish the perfect conditions for murder. "He's been planning this for almost a year," Frank told me. "The wine was just the delivery method. He needed to establish a pattern that would give him regular access to you when you were alone and ensure he could monitor your physical condition as the poison took effect." Frank also discovered that Vincent had been making inquiries about the probate process and had even consulted with an estate attorney about expediting inheritance procedures. He'd been preparing for my death long before he started poisoning me. The most disturbing discovery came when Frank investigated Vincent's online activity. My son had been researching digitalis poisoning, heart attack symptoms, and methods for making murder look like natural death. He'd visited forums where people discussed perfect crimes and had downloaded articles about undetectable poisons. "This wasn't a crime of passion," Frank explained. "This was premeditated, calculated murder. Your son spent months planning how to kill you and get away with it." As Frank spoke, I felt something inside me break. This wasn't just betrayal, it was the systematic destruction of everything I'd believed about my relationship with my only child. Vincent didn't love me, didn't respect me, didn't even see me as human. To him, I was nothing more than an obstacle between him and the money he needed. Margaret and I sat in our living room that evening, surrounded by evidence of Vincent's betrayal. Bank statements, medical records, Frank's investigation reports, and the mason jars of poisoned wine created a tableau of calculated evil that seemed impossible to believe. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at the evidence spread across our coffee table, evidence that my son had been systematically planning my murder for months. The boy I'd raised, the child I'd loved unconditionally, had been visiting me every Sunday not to show affection, but to monitor my dying process. The weight of that betrayal was crushing, but beneath the pain something else was growing. A cold, determined anger that would shape everything that came next. I spent 3 sleepless nights planning what I would say to Vincent. Margaret wanted me to go straight to the police, but I needed to hear the truth from my son's own mouth. I needed to understand how the child I'd raised had become capable of such calculated evil. Frank advised against confronting Vincent directly. "These situations can turn violent quickly," he warned. "Your son has already shown he's capable of murder. Don't give him the opportunity to finish what he started." But I couldn't live with uncertainty. I needed to look Vincent in the eye and hear him explain why my life meant so little to him. I planned the confrontation carefully. Margaret would be at her sister's house genuinely this time, with instructions to call the police if she didn't hear from me by 8 o'clock. Frank would be parked across the street, watching the house. I'd wear a small recording device hidden under my shirt to capture whatever Vincent said. I called Vincent on Thursday morning, 3 days before his usual Sunday visit. "Son, could you come by tomorrow evening? There's something important I need to discuss with you." Vincent's voice was immediately suspicious. "What kind of something, Dad? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine. I just need to talk to you about some family matters. Can you be here around 6? "Sure, Dad. I'll be there." Friday evening arrived grey and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I'd set up the living room like a courtroom with the evidence of Vincent's betrayal arranged on the coffee table. The mason jars of poisoned wine, Frank's investigation report, the falsified medical records, and printouts of Vincent's online research into digitalis poisoning. Vincent arrived precisely at 6, carrying another bottle of wine. When he saw the display on the coffee table, he stopped in the doorway, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, cold calculation. "What's all this, Dad?" His voice was steady, but I could see his mind working, evaluating his options. "Sit down, Vincent. We need to talk." He remained standing, clutching the wine bottle like a weapon. "I think maybe I should leave. You seem upset about something." I said, "Sit down." Something in my tone must have convinced him that running wasn't an option yet. Vincent slowly lowered himself into the chair across from me, setting the wine bottle on the floor beside him. "I know what you've been doing," I said simply. Vincent's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you mean, Dad. You're not making sense." I picked up one of the mason jars and held it up to the light. 8 months of poisoned wine, Vincent. 8 months of digitalis designed to weaken my heart until you could deliver a fatal dose. For a moment, Vincent said nothing. Then, to my surprise, he began to laugh. Not nervously or defensively, but with genuine amusement, as if I'd told him a particularly funny joke. "You think I've been poisoning you?" He shook his head, still chuckling. "Dad, that's ridiculous. Where would you even get an idea like that?" "I had the wine tested. I know about the digitalis." Vincent's laughter stopped abruptly. He studied my face for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. The mask of the caring son slipped away, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Well," he said finally, his voice completely different now. "I guess we're past pretending, aren't we?" The change in his demeanor was chilling. Gone was any trace of the man who'd been visiting me every Sunday, expressing concern for my health and well-being. In his place sat someone I barely recognized as my son. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Vincent shrugged as if the question was barely worth considering. "Why do you think? Money, obviously. I would have helped you if you needed money. You didn't have to try to kill me." "Help me?" Vincent's voice turned bitter. "You mean give me a lecture about responsibility and maybe loan me a few $1,000s? That wouldn't have solved anything." "So, murder was your solution?" "Murder?" Vincent tilted his head, considering the word. "I prefer to think of it as accelerating the inevitable. You're 63 years old, Dad. You have heart problems. You were going to die soon anyway. I just helped move things along." The casual way he discussed my death was more terrifying than any anger or emotion would have been. Vincent wasn't speaking like someone who'd been driven to desperate measures. He was speaking like someone who'd made a reasonable business decision. "You're my son," I said, hoping to reach whatever humanity might still exist in him. "And you're a means to an end," Vincent replied without hesitation. "Look, Dad, I don't hate you. This isn't personal. I just needed you dead, and I found an efficient way to make that happen." "The debts," I said. "The gambling. The threats." Vincent's eyes sharpened. "You've been busy. Yes, I owe some unpleasant people a significant amount of money. Your life insurance policy and inheritance would have solved that problem permanently." "Would have?" Vincent smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, obviously that plan is no longer viable. You've figured it out, which means you'll either go to the police or try to cut me out of your will. Either way, I don't get the money I need." "So what now?" Vincent picked up the wine bottle he'd brought and examined the label thoughtfully. "Now I have to consider my remaining options." The threat was unmistakable. Vincent was telling me that if he couldn't inherit my money legally, he might resort to more direct methods of obtaining it. "There are people watching this house," I said, hoping to deter him from whatever he was considering. "If something happens to me, you will be the first suspect." "I know," Vincent said calmly. "I saw your private investigator parked across the street. Frank Morrison, former detective, decent reputation. You've been thorough." The fact that he knew about Frank sent a chill down my spine. Vincent had been watching me just as carefully as I'd been investigating him. "So you understand that your plan has failed," I said. "This plan has failed," Vincent corrected. "But I'm resourceful. I'll think of something else." He stood up, leaving the wine bottle on the floor. "You know, Dad, I actually respect you for figuring this out. I didn't think you had it in you. For 8 months, you were the perfect victim. Trusting, isolated, predictable. I honestly thought you'd die without ever suspecting anything. What changed you, Vincent? You weren't always like this." Vincent paused at the door and looked back at me. For a moment I thought I saw something human in his expression. But when he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact. "Nothing changed me, Dad. This is who I've always been. You just never paid enough attention to notice." After Vincent left, I sat in the living room surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, replaying his words in my mind. The most chilling part wasn't his admission of guilt or his casual discussion of my murder. It was his claim that this had always been his nature, that I'd simply been blind to who my son really was. I called Margaret and told her it was safe to come home. When she arrived and saw my face, she knew immediately that the confrontation had confirmed our worst fears. "What did he say?" she asked. "He admitted everything. All of it." Margaret sank into her chair, looking suddenly older. "What do we do now?" I looked at the wine bottle Vincent had left behind, a final gift that I suspected contained enough poison to kill us both. My son had essentially declared war, promising to find another way to get what he wanted. But Vincent had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me completely. He thought I was just a weak old man, easy to manipulate and easier to kill. He had no idea what he'd awakened by threatening the only family I had left. The confrontation was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The week following my confrontation with Vincent was the strangest of my life. I moved through my daily routines with a hypervigilance I hadn't felt since Vietnam, constantly aware of my surroundings, watching for signs that my son might be planning something desperate. But Vincent, it seemed, had vanished. No phone calls, no surprise visits, no attempts to contact Margaret or me. Frank's surveillance confirmed that Vincent was still going to work and maintaining his normal routines, but he made no move toward our house. "He's probably planning something," Frank warned during one of our daily check-ins. "Men like your son don't give up easily when they're desperate." I knew Frank was right, but I also knew something he didn't. Vincent wasn't just desperate for money, he was arrogant. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, including me. That arrogance would be his downfall. On the following Wednesday, exactly 5 days after our confrontation, I received a call from Detective Sarah Chen of the local police department. "Mr. Holloway, we need to speak with you about some concerning information we've received regarding your son." I'd been expecting this call. "I'll be right there." At the police station, Detective Chen led me into a small interview room where another man was waiting. He introduced himself as Agent Mike Rodriguez from the DEA. "Mr. Holloway," Agent Rodriguez began, "we understand you've discovered that your son has been obtaining controlled substances illegally." I nodded. "The digitalis in the wine. He's been using his pharmaceutical connections to acquire it." "That's part of it," Detective Chen said, opening a thick file. "But there's more. We've been investigating a network of pharmaceutical sales representatives who've been diverting prescription medications for illegal sale. Your son's name came up in our investigation several weeks ago." Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. "When you contacted the lab to test that wine, your friend Tom did the right thing by reporting the digitalis to us. That gave us probable cause to look deeper into your son's activities. What they discovered was larger than Vincent's plan to murder me. He'd been stealing and reselling controlled substances for over 2 years, using his legitimate sales position to cover his illegal activities. The gambling debts I'd learned about were just the beginning. Vincent had been living far beyond his means, funding an expensive lifestyle through drug trafficking. The digitalis was probably intended for you specifically," Detective Chen explained, "but we found evidence that he's been diverting other cardiac medications, painkillers, and even some experimental drugs that haven't been approved for general use." "What does this mean?" I asked. "It means your son is facing federal drug trafficking charges in addition to attempted murder," Agent Rodriguez said. "The evidence you provided, combined with our ongoing investigation, gives us everything we need for prosecution." I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Vincent's fate was no longer my responsibility to manage. The system would handle his punishment, and I wouldn't have to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. The arrest happened that same afternoon. Frank called me with the details. Federal agents had taken Vincent into custody at his office in front of his colleagues and supervisors. The charges included drug trafficking, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and attempted murder. Margaret and I watched the news that evening, seeing my son's face on the television screen as reporters discussed his arrest. The man on TV looked like Vincent, but he seemed like a stranger. The person I'd known or thought I'd known had been an elaborate fiction. "Do you feel sorry for him?" Margaret asked as we turned off the TV. I considered the question seriously. I feel sorry for the child I thought I raised, but I don't feel sorry for the man he actually became. Vincent's trial took place 8 months later. I testified about the poisoned wine, the systematic manipulation, and his admission of guilt during our final confrontation. The recording I'd made that evening was played for the jury, Vincent's cold discussion of my murder filling the courtroom. He was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. During the sentencing hearing, Vincent showed no remorse, no recognition that he'd done anything wrong. He looked at me once across the courtroom and his expression was one of irritation, as if I'd caused him an inconvenience rather than saved my own life. After the trial, Margaret and I began the process of rebuilding our life. I changed my will, removing Vincent entirely and establishing a trust for any future grandchildren I might have through other relationships. I updated my medical records to remove the false information Vincent had provided to Dr. Martinez. I even replaced all the wine in my collection, unable to look at the bottles without remembering Sunday afternoons spent unknowingly sipping poison. But the most significant change was internal. I stopped feeling guilty about Vincent's choices. For months after his arrest, I'd tortured myself with questions about where I'd gone wrong as a father, what I could have done differently, how I'd failed to see who he really was. Margaret helped me understand that Vincent's actions weren't my fault. "Some people are born broken," she told me one evening as we sat on our porch watching the sunset. "You gave him every advantage, every opportunity to be a good person. What he chose to do with those gifts was up to him." Frank, who'd become something of a friend during our ordeal, put it more bluntly. "Your son is a sociopath. Nothing you did or didn't do would have changed that. You're lucky you figured out his game before he killed you." 3 years have passed since Vincent's arrest. Margaret and I have found a peace I never thought possible after such betrayal. We travel now, taking trips we'd always planned but never made time for. We've strengthened our relationships with friends and neighbors, building the kind of community connections that Vincent had tried to isolate me from. I still think about those Sunday afternoons sometimes, remembering how grateful I felt for what I thought was my son's attention and care. The irony isn't lost on me that the moments when I felt most loved were actually the moments when I was closest to death. But I don't dwell on the betrayal anymore. Instead, I focus on the life I almost lost and the woman who helped save it. Margaret and I make our own Sunday traditions now. We cook together, tend our garden, and visit with friends who genuinely care about our well-being. Last month, we received word that Vincent had been denied parole. He'll serve at least another 15 years in prison. Part of me wonders if he ever thinks about what he lost when he chose money over family, but I suspect he doesn't. Sociopaths, I've learned, don't experience regret the way normal people do. The wine cellar in our basement sits empty now. I can't bring myself to fill it again, and Margaret understands. Some associations are too painful to overcome, some memories too poisonous to preserve. Instead, we keep that space as a reminder of what we survived. Not a shrine to betrayal, but a testament to the strength that emerges when you refuse to be a victim. Vincent thought he could manipulate and destroy me, but in the end his own greed and arrogance destroyed him instead. I'm 71 years old now, and I've learned something important. Family isn't defined by blood or obligation. It's defined by genuine care, mutual respect, and the kind of love that doesn't come with conditions or hidden agendas. Margaret and I have built that kind of family together, surrounded by friends who visit not because they want something from us, but because they enjoy our company. We have Sunday dinners with neighbors, not Sunday poisonings with predators. The child I raised may have become a monster, but the life I chose to build after his betrayal became something beautiful. In the end, that simple lie that saved my life on that crucial Sunday wasn't just about surviving Vincent's immediate plan. It was about claiming the right to write my own ending, to choose love over manipulation, truth over deception, and peace over the poison that some people mistake for family. That's the real victory, not Vincent's imprisonment, but my freedom.